Right. So, as Father Grant explained, today is the day of the season of creation, and we're following the theme of stewardship, which is why the sanctuary is looking like it is. It's symbolizing this idea that we have a responsibility as Christians to look after this world, and that's termed under this term sort of stewardship. For me, sort of when I think of stewardship, the first image that sort of came to my mind was when I was very, very little. I used to go to the football or the soccer with my father. And at the ground, there were the stewards who made sure you behaved and sat. If you couldn't find your seat, they would direct you, and there was your seat. They'd make sure you behaved and didn't sort of try and run on the pitch or do anything wrong. And basically, there were these people in high-vis jackets who looked after you. But the theme of stewardship expands more than that. That's just one example. And today we're going to look at how, as Christians, we're called to be stewards and how that has an impact on our lives. In particular, I want to focus at the beginning of this Genesis reading that we've heard, from verses 26 to 28, and look around the idea of being created in God's image and the fact that that leads to us being able to rule over the world and what that exactly means. But first, I want to unpack a few challenges of this verse. Historically, this verse has been used to point the finger at Christians. When environmental awareness was sort of becoming a thing in the 90s and so forth, those who were leading sort of the ecological call were saying, you Christians, you don't care for the world. You just want to rule over it, sort of do what you like, treat the animals and stuff, because you've been told you can rule over it and do what you like to them. And so you've just got this idea that there's a new earth coming, so this one doesn't matter. Let's not worry about it too much. Let's just do what we like, because God created us higher, so we can do what we want, and this new earth will come and it'll be fine. And really, that's in my view, a wrong interpretation of what is going on in this verse. And what have we been told? We're not being told to rule over in this sort of dominative, subjective way, or this sort of like a dictatorship. That's a message we don't hear about as Christians. We're not called to be dictators. So I really want to unpack what this means and then apply it to our lives. So first, just to sort of give a bit of background to this reading, sort of the Genesis reading that is, it's genre. So there's a big argument over science and creation and how we can use Genesis. And I'm not going to touch on that today. That's not my aim. If you want to know a bit about that, David Morris spoke on it last week about the relation between science and Christianity and how they're not exclusive. That is on our website if you want to go and listen to that. But what I am going to say is, for me, Genesis is very poetic. These opening chapters are very poetic. And just like all poetry, it's the meaning below the text that it's evoking that's important. Poetry has more than its surface value, and there's something greater and deeper. And we start to look at this, get a feel for what this greater and deeper message is when we look at the bigger context for where this reading comes. So in this reading, it's the 7 days of creation. And up to now, we've had up to the 5th day of creation. And in that, it's very quick. This happens, God says, let there be light, and there was light, and then so forth. But when we get to day 6, it slows right down. The focus really, the speed of the narrative slows down, and it focuses on humankind. So this starts to point our attention to this verse is telling us something about who we are in a more than just the face value of what it says. There's a deeper meaning behind it, and it's to do with us and who we are and our identity. And so I want to focus on, as I said, the beginning bit, because for me, we can break the structure of the reading we've heard into the beginning. So those first few verses, Genesis 1:26, that sort of sums up the whole thing. And then from 28 to the end of chapter 1 focuses on explaining what it is to have stewardship. And then chapter 2 looks at the importance of rest. But for me, we're focusing on that beginning bit, that idea of stewardship. In this text, we just read it translated it rule over. Other texts translated dominion, and others still translated stewardship. It is that idea that as we've been created in God's image, we have some sort of authority in this world. And so it's to that image of God saying, let us make man in our image. Firstly, the introduction of that is really key. Before, it said, come forth from the world. When he created the animals, it said, come forth from the world, all living creatures on the ground. But when he comes to creating humankind, it's let us make man. It's God making man. We're not coming from the earth, we're coming from God. So our primary identity is coming from God, not from the earth. So that really sets it there. And then just a clear what he means by man. In the Hebrew, it's gender inclusive for mankind, so the whole of humanity. And this really comes clear in 27 when it says male and female in our image. So it's not exclusive when it's talking, let us make man in our image. It's not just this male sex, but but it's all male and female. And while we're on that point, the importance of that is that this image of God is seen not just in one gender, one sex. We have to take the whole of humanity to see the fullness of God, to see the fullness of His image. Each and every one of us portrays something of that image and has that inherently to us. And the idea, again, of making God in our image, in the Jewish culture, this idea of compartmentalizing things and sort of like you have your mind and your soul and your body, and they're all separate from each other, is completely alien to their thought. So this idea of us being in God's image it's very holistic. The whole of us is in God's image, not just one little bit of us, not just our imagination, not just our creativity, the whole of us. And so this message should touch the whole of us, not just a little bit, not just what we think about, but our whole being is created in the image of God. And of course, there was the effects of the fall, which we will look at and explore later. But we read in Genesis 9:6 about how if we shed any other's blood, we should not do so because they are created in God's image. And so this narrative is coming after the fall and shows us that this image we're created in isn't destroyed by the fall, isn't destroyed by sin. Sin affects the image, but doesn't destroy it. We are still created in God's image now. Each one of us is still created in God's image. And then that has an effect. And that effect is the rule over or dominion. But what does this term mean? So at first it sounds very, very negative, which is why the verse is so easily misunderstood, and that we should just rule over, like a dictator rules over the country or rules over his people. He doesn't care about the people. He just wants to benefit himself. But our God is not a dictator. Our God is a loving God. And as such, this rule over is a consequence of our being created in the image of God. It's not the content, it's not just a thing on itself, but it's a consequence coming out of being created in the image of God. And so as we start to understand what it means to be created in the image of God, we understand how we should become stewards and how we should rule over the world, how we should be behaving. And just to expand on a few other points before we go on to unpack this verse, is the idea that when it goes on in verse 28, it says, God bless them. So again, this idea that us being able to rule over, have this dominion is a blessing. It's something we've been given, and with a blessing, there comes a responsibility. So you're blessed to be a blessing to others. And then also looking at sort of be fruitful and multiply. That's another verse that's continually just seen very narrow as sort of to procreate. But this idea of being fruitful and multiply is this idea of spreading the image of God throughout the world. It's not just this very basic sort of human instinct just to procreate, but it's this more spiritual, this bigger idea that God's image should be throughout the world, and there should be a consequence of that. That God's image should create a consequence, and that it should be spread throughout the world, and that's a great thing. As we hear in the reading, God surveys His creation, and the totality of it is very good. Each individual thing that was created in each day is good, but when He looks at all 6 days in one, it's very good. So God created this very good world, and He bestowed us the authority to look after it. So now looking at how this verse applies to us today, you may now be expecting me sort of to talk about how we should go green, how we should recycle, different ways we can save the planet, and so forth. And while that is a good and proper use of this verse, it's not going to be my main focus. For me, my main focus is, what does it mean to us to be created in the image of God? How does it affect us? What is its importance? And what do we understand by it? And how do we take that into our lives? How do we actualize it? How do we take what we know up here to be what happens out here? So for me, being created in the image of God, it's such a beautiful thing. It's such a beautiful image and such a beautiful concept. This idea that sort of is almost so we can feel God's love in just those words, that He created us in His image. It's sort of very loving. And sort of in Psalm 139, verse 14, it reads, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works that I know very well. And here we get the idea that being created in God is a wonderful thing. Fearful here is not sort of fear in afraid, but sort of in awe and wonder. To stand in awe and wonder. And that the God would create us in His image gives us awe and wonder. And so the first point I want to raise of being created in God's image is that it gives us worth. Who we are, it makes us worth something. We're not just a part of creation. We're something with a higher purpose. We have worth. We're created in awe and wonder. As we read in Psalm 8, verse 3-6. When I look at your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? mortals that you care for them, yet you have made them a little lower than God, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hand. You have put all things under their feet. God could have made us at the same level as the animals, but he didn't. We have so much worth, so much inherent worth from that he made us a little lower than God. He chose that, and he chose to give you that worth and that identity, which is our second point. That not only do we have worth in being created in the image of God, we start to develop our identity, who we are and what we do. As we read in Ephesians 4:22-24, you were taught to put away your former way of life, your old self, corrupt and deluded by its lust, and to renew in the spirit of your minds, and to clothe yourself with the new self, created according to the likeness of God, in true righteousness and holiness. In this verse, Paul is telling the Ephesians believers not to be like those who forget what the image of God is, who chase after sort of impurity and practice greed, but to realize that we are created in the image of God, and that thanks to Christ we now have a more solid example of what that should be and what our identity should form that, and that we should take on that identity, we should take it to be our own. In Colossians 3:10 it writes, "Clothe yourselves with this new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of our Creator." So this idea that we are made in God's image, and that we should draw our identity from. And thanks to Christ, we have a solid example of what that identity is, who we should be. We saw Christ come and walk among us. And now, although the sinners sort of block that image of being created in God, thanks to Christ, we have a way to get back to it, to get a stronger understanding of who we should be and what we should be. As brothers and sisters in Christ, how we should behave, who we should look after. So that the call to look after our world comes from our identity as Christians. And so that leads on to our third point, which is that of purpose. Being created in God's image gives us purpose. Not only does it make us valuable and gives us our identity, but it then leads us into what we should do and guides us in what we should do. In Hebrews 2, verse 8-9, it basically, in this Hebrews verse, it quotes the Psalm 8 I read earlier, and then expands on how we should act in response to that. So it reads, "Now in subjecting all things to them, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So in this we sort of see our purpose is to be like Christ, to taste death for everyone, so that Christ sacrificed himself. He sacrificed his own needs for the greater good of the others. And so if we're meant to be stewards, if we're meant to be created in God's image and rule over the world, then that ruling over happens in God's image. It happens in that likeness. It happens in that willing to sacrifice. We're not called to rule the world in a way that just neglects it and takes it for our own advantage and just doesn't care about it. We're called to sacrifice, be a sacrificial leader, and to care. This one verse is Matthew 28:19-20 reads, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember that I am with you always to the end of the ages." Now you might think I've gone very off topic, and this is about evangelism, which it is, but it's not just about evangelism. It says, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. That is our purpose. God has commanded us to look after this earth. If we say in Genesis we were told to rule over and have dominion, and that dominion should be drawn on what it is to be created in God's life, then this verse applies to not just creating disciples and baptizing them, but creating people who care for God's planet. It's not just a spiritual, convert and that's great. It's something more than that. It's that idea of be fruitful and multiply, that God's presence can fill this earth and people can feel the difference that makes. Not just in yourself, but in the world around us and what the world looks like. So we're seeing that we're called as being created in God's image makes that we should be stewards of this earth, that our ruling over should be done in a positive way that has a positive impact, and that includes things like recycling and social welfare and caring for our planet and caring for those in it. Yet this isn't the reality. As I've been hinting at, sin entered in. Sin corrupted us. As the narrative we read in sort of Genesis 3, we sort of start to see the fall. We ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We wanted to be like God. We didn't want just our likeness to be drawn from him and know what we should be by looking at him. We wanted to be our own thing. We wanted to be this. And so sin entered in and it corrupted how we understand our image of God. In fact, it took away the image of God and we started to looking at the image of self. And we forgot how to care for our world. We forgot how to care for each other. So, in relation to those 3 points of identity, worth, and purpose, in relation to our identity, it was about me. It's what do I want? Not what God calls for us, not that I'm creating God's image, it's I'm creating my own image and I'm going to make myself look good. Sort of when we look at our own marketing, Nike would tell you, just do it. Who cares? Just do it. You want those sneakers? Get them. They're going to make you look good. It's our identity cares. And then L'Oreal would back them up and say, oh, you're worth it. You deserve it. Don't worry about sort of if we use slave labor to make your shoes or if we test your product on animals. Don't worry about that. No, just get your sneakers. Don't focus on what's happening in the back. They're going to make you look good, and that's what's important, your identity. So don't build it on anything else. And that's what we've become. We've forgotten what it is to look to others, and we look to self, and we're concerned more of our self-identity than building our identity from God. And to give an example, it's even sort of infected our relationships. Something that God gave us to sort of show his love and experience the love of the Trinity. God gave us relationships to have with one another, yet we've turned them into a commodity. I remember I was sitting on a train the other day and someone was speaking quite loudly, so I overheard it and said, oh no, I couldn't be with someone for 10 years. After a while, they won't suit my needs. Like the idea that you're meant to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend because they tick X, Y, and Z and make you feel A, B, and C. It's what I get out of it. It's about me and my identity. And this boyfriend, he doesn't make me look so cool anymore, I'm going to get rid of him. Or this girlfriend, no, she's not so pretty, I'm going to get rid of her. We've lost our identity, and we've lost our care for those around us. We focus on ourselves. We sort of think, I need to look good, so this is looking dirty here, so I'm just going to get rid of it. That's what it's turned into. We don't care what we're doing over there. And what about our worth, though? This is a great irony for me. So in looking at the image of God, we draw our identity and our worth. But in looking to self, we almost lose the wonder of our worth. We lose the fact that we are wonderfully and beautifully made. And we don't see our worth. We think we don't look good enough. We're not pretty. We're not attractive. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I don't want to. But I'm sure each one and every us in here has thought, I'm being a bit fat, or I don't look so great in the mirror, or I wish I could look like her. We don't see how beautiful we are, how greatly and wonderfully made we are. So we focus on ourselves, yet we forget how beautiful we are. And we just want to consume to make us look better. And forget the impact that's having on others, because no, it's what I look like that looks good, and I need to look better because I don't look good. Drawing on the marketing again, Maybelline, the market brand, they'll tell you don't look good as Maybelline. You're not born with it. But you are, because you are created in God's image. You have a worth, but we've lost sight of that. And that leads to our purpose. We've forgotten our purpose, and our purpose sort of goes either one or two ways. We either focus on worldly success and building up our personal status, or we just don't care. It's all worthless, it's all pointless, there's no greater worth. So in the first example, we consume to make ourselves look good. We don't get a thing because we say we need it. We get a thing because it's going to make us look good. So we'll get like a luxury SUV, not because we need to go 4x4ing and carry lots of load lugging, but because it's going to make us look cool. We could live in a city and get a nice small city car of low consumption, lower carbon footprint, but no, we don't want to do that because that doesn't make us look good. So we draw, and it's like, screw the environment. I want this car, I want to look good. Doesn't matter what it's doing. And so that's the way that it focuses our identity on success of this world. But then there's the other one that focuses, our purpose. Lose sight of any purpose. Like, this is all pointless, this is not worth anything. So we don't bother recycling, because what's the point? Nobody else is. Why should I do it? We're all just going to die anyway, so there's no point. The world's a mess, so we just give up. And so we lose sight of our purpose. And so we've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten what it means to be created in the image of God. So the challenge today is to realize what it means to be created in the image of God. For you to re-embrace that, to realize that you do have a worth. You are wonderfully and beautifully made. that you do have that identity, to draw that identity from Christ, to not be corrupted by the world that tells you you're not good enough, but to realize you are, and to draw that identity from God, and to realize your purpose in that identity. Our purpose isn't just the spiritual gifts we've been given, but each and every one of us is called to rule over this world. And ruling over this world does not mean to subject it to our own needs, to our own wants, but to realize how God would do it, how God's creatures would do it. And it is created in God's image. We are called to care. We are called to exercise that care for the world. Ultimately, when we turn to self, this is what we do to the world. But when we turn to God, we realize we shouldn't be doing this to the world, and we start to try and make a change. We realize there's people outside who are not going to, but we realize it matters because my identity is drawn from Christ, and that I am going to try and change this world. Because it's not about what this may succeed in this world, or not about what may not succeed in the world. It's about following Christ and realizing that in that, our identity is drawn, and our identity teaches us that we should care for one another and this creation. So now the challenge from me, from you today, is how this week are you going to live in response to this genuine image of being created in God's image and likeness? Amen.